I had just finished another long night shift, patrolling the quiet banks of the Seine, my radio still crackling faintly with static, when the first light of dawn began to wash the stone bridges in pale gold. Paris at that hour feels like it belongs only to those who have been awake through the darkness. The street sweepers brushing away yesterday's footsteps. The early bakers carrying trays of bread that send out waves of warm scent into the chilly morning air. I've walked these streets for years, yet that morning something unusual caught me. At first, I thought it was only a black garbage bag left half hidden against the iron railings near the Pont Neuf, a crumpled shape tossed aside after the night's chaos. I almost walked past it, but then I saw it shift. Not the wind, not a trick of the eye. A shallow, trembling rise and fall, as if the city itself was breathing through that broken pile. I stopped, squinted through the dim light. My heart dropped when I realized what it was. A puppy. A tiny French Bulldog, maybe 4 months old, black-coated but so filthy and matted that his natural color blended into the grime of the cobblestones. His body was curled tight as if trying to vanish into himself, every rib visible beneath skin stretched too thin. His sides rose unevenly, shallow breaths making the small frame shudder. Paris is noisy even in its quiet moments, bus brakes hissing, pigeons fluttering under the bridges, a scooter rattling past. But all I could hear in that instant was the faint sound of his breathing, fragile and irregular, as though each inhale was a battle he wasn't sure he would win. I crouched down, and for a second I hesitated. I've seen abandoned animals before. Working security in the city, you learn to look away, because there are too many small tragedies in corners no one visits. But the way his eyes blinked open, glassy, rimmed with dirt, trying to focus on me as if weighing whether I meant mercy or more pain. Something in that look erased the distance I'd built up over the years. He wasn't just some stray. He was a child, left behind in a city that doesn't stop moving. His paw twitched as he tried to shift, but the movement collapsed under his own weakness. I reached out carefully, speaking low, though I wasn't sure he even understood. My fingers hovered above his trembling body, the stench of damp stone and unwashed fur rising up, and I felt an odd shame for the world, for myself, that it had taken me this long to notice him. The sun kept climbing, spilling light across the river, making the towers of Notre Dame glow like a painting. Yet here, at my feet, was something darker, smaller, still fighting not to fade away. And in that pause with the city awakening around us, I knew that if I left, he would not last another day. I didn't have a plan, not even the first thought of what to do. But I stayed crouched there, breathing with him, waiting for the courage to reach that last inch and touch him. That was the moment I understood. This was no accident. This was the beginning of something I couldn't walk away from. I couldn't shake the fear that if I moved too suddenly, he would bolt, or worse, collapse where he lay. The little French Bulldog barely had the strength to keep his head up, but instinct still kept his body tense, coiled with the last scraps of energy. Around us, Paris was waking fast. The clatter of shutters opening, the rumble of a delivery truck across the bridge, voices rising and overlapping in that unmistakable Parisian rhythm. Yet within that chaos, it felt like there was only him and me, suspended in a fragile silence that could shatter with the wrong sound. I lowered myself until my knees touched the cold stones, speaking softly as if I were trying to soothe a frightened child. His ears twitched weakly, flattened against his head, and his eyes darted toward the river, toward escape. But his body betrayed him. His legs gave nothing when he tried to shift, and the motion ended in a tiny collapse that pressed his chest harder into the ground. I saw the glint of moisture along his nostrils, the uneven drag of his breath. For a moment, I thought I was already too late. I pulled off my jacket and laid it on the ground beside him, not daring to touch him yet. The smell rising from him was sharp, urine, damp stone, spoiled food, and that sickly sweet note that clings to starvation. I told myself not to flinch, not to let him see disgust in my face, only calm. My hands trembled anyway as I whispered, "It's all right, Petite. No one's going to hurt you now." When I finally inched closer, I noticed his paws. They were caked in dried mud, nails worn down to uneven stubs, the pads cracked as if he had walked too many miles on streets that had never cared for him. He blinked up at me again, the whites of his eyes raw, and something softened. Not trust. Not yet, but something smaller, like a flicker of recognition that I wasn't a threat. His chest rattled with the effort of one small sigh, and then, slowly, he let his chin drop onto the edge of my jacket. That was the first contact. Not my hand, not yet, but his choice to let his tiny head rest against something I'd placed near him. I felt the weight of it more than if he had leaned against me fully. My heart pounded in my throat. Around us, people kept walking, glancing quickly, some pretending not to notice at all, as if a dying puppy on the stones of Paris was nothing unusual. But for me, time had narrowed to this fragile creature breathing against the fabric of my coat. I leaned closer, lowering my voice until it was almost a whisper, promising him that I wouldn't leave him here. I didn't know how I would make good on that promise yet. Where to take him, who would help, what it would cost. But in that moment, under the arch of Pont Neuf, with the morning sun creeping higher, I made the only choice I could. I stayed. I stayed with him, waiting for the courage to lift him, praying that when I did, his frail body wouldn't go limp in my arms. I remember the moment I finally placed my hand on him. His fur was rough, brittle, stiff with layers of grime that clung like old dust to stone. Beneath that texture was no softness, no puppy warmth, only the jut of bones pressing up as though they were too eager to escape his skin. My fingers trembled as I stroked just once along his back, and the reaction came like a crack through the silence. He flinched. Not a bark, not even a whimper, just a sharp tremor that shook his whole tiny frame, the way you'd see a bird hit glass and fold in on itself. I froze, terrified I'd broken something fragile inside him. The city around us didn't pause. A tourist group shuffled by, their guide lifting an umbrella like a flag, their chatter rising in several languages that blurred into the hum of traffic and the laughter of early commuters. No one noticed the small battle happening at the base of the bridge, between fear and trust, between survival and surrender. My voice cracked as I whispered again, slower this time. It's all right. You're safe. You're safe. He blinked, his eyes huge against his narrow skull, and for a moment I could see both desperation and suspicion flicker in the same glance. His chest rattled with another uneven breath. Then, as though all the energy had been poured into that single shudder, he stopped resisting. His body sagged into stillness, not quite relaxed, but no longer fighting against my touch. When I slipped my arms beneath him, I realized just how light he was. 4 months old, and he felt no heavier than a loaf of bread from one of the nearby boulangeries. His ribs cut against my palms, his belly hollow, legs dangling without strength to push against anything. And still, even in that weakness, I felt the tiniest vibration, a faint, muffled whine pressed into my chest, the sound of a creature who had spent too long without anyone to answer his cries. The smell hit harder then, clinging to my clothes as I drew him close. Sour, damp, the reek of garbage bins that line the alleys. But beneath it all, there was a faint trace of something almost sweet, a reminder that he was still alive, still a puppy beneath the layers of neglect. I pressed my jacket around him, shielding him from the morning air, though the real chill came not from the weather, but from the thought that he had been here alone, breathing against stone, through nights far colder than this. I stood, clutching him close, watching the sunlight strike the towers of Notre Dame across the river. The city was dazzling, alive, magnificent. And yet here in my arms was its forgotten child, black-coated, fragile, too small for the weight of such a place. My throat tightened as I thought. If I hadn't stopped, if I had walked by like the others, he would still be lying there, waiting for a kindness that might never come. And though his head pressed limply into my arm, I felt the faintest stir, the smallest twitch of a paw, a fragile sign that he was still fighting, even as the strength drained from him. That flicker of life was enough to push me forward, to turn my steps toward whatever came next, knowing the real struggle was only beginning. I started walking without even knowing where my feet were taking me. The weight of him pressed into my chest like a reminder that every second mattered. He was so light, so frighteningly light, that I kept looking down just to reassure myself he was still breathing. His eyes would flutter open, unfocused, and then close again with a weak shiver that traveled down his whole body. Each time he sighed, shallow and rattled, my heart lurched with the fear that it might be his last. The streets of Paris unfolded around us in their usual rhythm, Cafe chairs scraped against cobblestones, vendors lifted shutters with metallic clangs, the faint perfume of baking bread carried on the breeze. People passed by, some glancing, most not, and I wanted to shout at them, to make them see what I was holding. How could they not stop, not care? But maybe they had already learned what I was only beginning to understand. You cannot save them all. Yet here, in my arms, was one, and he was mine now, whether I was ready for it or not. The nearest clinic I knew was still blocks away, tucked near the Marais. I adjusted him gently, cradling his head as I walked faster. Every so often his paw twitched against my arm, a tiny protest, or maybe just the nervous reflex of his weakened body. I whispered to him as I moved, more for myself than for him. Stay with me. Just stay awake a little longer. The words were shaky, my throat tight, but saying them felt like keeping him tethered, like if I stopped speaking, he might slip away into silence. Halfway there, I ducked into a narrow side street for shelter from the rush of morning crowds. I set him down on my lap, just long enough to check him, my hands trembling as I traced the sharp ridges of his ribs. His fur was sticky with patches of dried filth, clumped together like tar, and beneath it, his skin looked too pale, too fragile. His ears twitched at the sound of a scooter whirring by the alley, and he made a faint noise, something between a sigh and a whimper. It was so soft I had to hold my breath to be sure I heard it. That sound broke me more than his silence ever could. It was proof he still had enough life left to call out, even if barely. I pressed him back against me and pushed forward again, weaving through streets that had never felt so endless. Every step was a question. Would he make it until we reached the clinic? Would they even take him in? Would they tell me it was already too late? By the time the green cross of the vet's sign came into view, my chest ached from the pace and from the terror coiled inside me. He stirred faintly, as though sensing the change, and I held him tighter, whispering again, promising without knowing how, "Almost there, petite, almost there." And in that moment, standing on the edge of the clinic's doorway, I realized this was no longer just an act of pity. It was a decision. His life and mine had already intertwined, and there was no turning back. The bell above the clinic door jingled softly as I pushed it open, the warmth inside rushing over us like a wave. The smell of disinfectant and fresh wood polish replaced the street's mix of exhaust and bread, and for a heartbeat, I felt like I had stepped into another world entirely. But in my arms, the reality remained. A 4-month-old black French Bulldog limp against my chest, every breath a fragile rattle. The receptionist glanced up, and her polite smile faltered the instant she saw what I was carrying. Without a word, she stood and gestured toward the back, her urgency louder than any question she could have asked. I followed, my legs unsteady, as if the city's noise had fallen away, and all that existed now was this hallway, this chance. The vet, a middle-aged man with kind eyes hidden behind rectangular glasses, looked up from a chart. He didn't waste time on small talk. "Put him here," he said, and I laid the puppy on the stainless steel table, my jacket still wrapped around his small frame. The metal surface seemed too cold, too sterile for a creature so frail, and I had to force myself to step back as gloved hands began to move with practiced calm. He pressed his stethoscope to the thin chest, frowned, and adjusted it again. I tried to read his face, every crease, every flicker, but he gave nothing away except the occasional, quiet sigh. "Severely malnourished," he murmured, almost to himself. "Dehydrated. Very weak." Then his eyes met mine, holding them steady. "He's on the edge. If you hadn't brought him in this morning..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. I swallowed hard, my throat thick, and asked the only question I could. "Can he make it?" The vet didn't answer right away. He clipped an IV line into place, adjusted a tiny needle, and the puppy gave the faintest whine at the prick, a sound so small yet so piercing it nearly undid me. I wanted to scoop him back into my arms, shield him from everything, but I stayed rooted, knowing this was the only way. Finally, the vet said, "He has a chance, but it will be touch and go. The next 24 hours will tell us everything." The words settled like a weight on my chest. A chance. Not hope, not certainty, just a flicker in the dark. I reached out, brushing my fingers gently along the curve of his head, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes. His eyes cracked open for a second, glazed but searching, and I whispered, "You hear that? You've got a chance, petite. Don't let go." The machines beeped softly, steady but fragile, echoing the rhythm of his fight. And as I stood there, watching strangers work to keep him alive, I realized the city outside would keep spinning without us. But here, in this small, sterile room in Paris, the world had narrowed to a single question. Would he live through the night? The night inside that clinic felt endless. I sat slouched in a hard plastic chair, my jacket draped around my shoulders, the smell of antiseptic clinging to the air so sharply it burned my nose. The only sound I truly heard was the faint beeping of the monitor beside his table. A fragile metronome measuring whether this little French bulldog would stay tethered to the world. Every rise and fall of his chest was a battle, his ribs lifting weakly under skin stretched too thin. The vet had left for a few hours of sleep, the nurses checking in now and then, but mostly it was just me and him. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, watching the black sheen of his fur glint under the fluorescent lights. It should have been beautiful, glossy and proud, but instead it was broken by patches of filth and mats that dulled its color. He twitched occasionally, paws moving as though running in some forgotten dream. But the movement always ended in a collapse of stillness that made my stomach twist with fear. I whispered to him through the long hours, as if the sound of a human voice might anchor him here. I told him about the city outside, the river glowing under the lamps, the way the bells of Notre Dame would ring in the morning, the smell of coffee and croissants that would drift down the boulevards. My words were clumsy, cracked with exhaustion, but I wanted to build a world for him beyond this steel table, something worth holding on to. There were moments I was sure I would lose him. Once, the monitor skipped, the beeps irregular, and I surged forward, hands pressed flat against the table as though I could will his heart to steady. His eyes fluttered, lips parted just enough for the faintest whimper to slip free. The sound broke through me, fragile and pleading, and I found myself promising things I had no right to promise. That he'd never be alone again, that I'd carry him through every dark corner this city tried to swallow him in. Hours bled into each other, until the first trace of dawn began leaking pale light through the narrow window above. My own eyes burned, my body aching from the vigil. But then something shifted. He stirred, not in the weak spasms of the night before, but with a small, deliberate push. His paw pressed against the blanket beneath him, slow and unsteady, but intentional. I leaned closer, holding my breath. His eyelids lifted just enough to reveal the faint shimmer of brown beneath the haze, and for the first time he looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. It lasted only seconds before he sagged back into sleep, but that look was enough. Enough to feel the scales tip ever so slightly from despair toward survival. I sat back, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the beeping steady again, the room suddenly less cold. And in that fragile quiet, I understood he hadn't chosen to let go. Not yet. The fight was still there, flickering like the first light on the Seine. And for the first time since I found him, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, he might see another day. Morning in Paris always arrives with layers of sound before light fully claims the streets. The rumble of delivery vans, the hiss of espresso machines, the chatter of early commuters, it all seeped faintly through the clinic's thin window panes. I had spent the whole night by his side, stiff-backed in that plastic chair, and when the vet returned, he found me still there. My jacket pulled tight around me, eyes fixed on the small black bundle on the table. The French Bulldog stirred just as the vet leaned in to check his vitals. It was the smallest thing, a twitch of his nose, a faint lift of his head, but enough to make my heart jolt. His eyes cracked open, hazy, confused, but searching. He looked weak, pitifully weak, yet there was something new behind that gaze, something that hadn't been there the day before. Awareness. The vet hummed under his breath, adjusting the IV line. He made it through the night, he said simply, but I heard the quiet weight in his tone. He didn't say he was safe, didn't say he would recover, but made it through the night was more than I dared to hope for when I carried him in from the street. I offered my hand, palm open, and after a pause that stretched long enough to ache, his nose pressed into it. The touch was dry, cracked, faintly warm. I let out a broken laugh, tears stinging my eyes before I could stop them. That tiny act, that decision to lean into me instead of away, felt like a victory larger than anything I'd expected. I asked quietly, What should I call him? It slipped out before I even thought, the question surprising even me. The vet looked up, raising an eyebrow. But he didn't answer, didn't interfere. Naming him meant claiming him, meant crossing a line I hadn't realized I was already standing on. I studied his little face, the way his black coat dulled with dirt, yet still caught the light in faint glimmers. His ears, folded and tired, gave him an almost comical dignity, even in weakness. His body was frail, ribs still pressing like ridges against the skin, but behind all that suffering was a spark. A survivor's spark. I whispered, almost shyly, "Noir. That's who you are." The French word for black felt right in this city, in this moment. It carried the weight of his struggle and yet also something strong, something unbreakable. When I spoke it, his eyelids fluttered and his paw shifted just slightly, pressing against the blanket. It was nothing more than a reflex, maybe, but I chose to believe it meant something, that on some level he heard me, claimed the name as his own. From that moment on, he wasn't just a stray fighting for life. He was Noir, my Noir. And with that name came a promise I hadn't even needed to voice. I would not let him go back to being invisible again. The hours that followed his naming felt different, as though the city outside had slowed its heartbeat to match his. Noir, that fragile little French bulldog I had found crumpled against stone, was no longer just surviving in my arms. He was beginning to respond, in tiny, almost imperceptible ways that made my chest ache with both fear and hope. The vet showed me how to hold the small syringe of water to his lips. My hands shook as I guided it, terrified he might choke, terrified it might be too much for him. For a moment he resisted, turning his head weakly away, but then the tip brushed against his dry tongue, and I saw it. The faintest ripple of movement as he swallowed. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Another drop, then another. Each swallow felt like a miracle, like watching a city long silent suddenly breathe again. We tried soft food next, a paste smeared delicately onto my fingertip. At first he ignored it, his eyes half-lidded, his head too heavy to lift. But when I touched it gently to his lips, there was a pause, then the faint scrape of his tongue. He licked once, then again, clumsy but deliberate. I laughed through tears. The sound cracked and raw. That's it, Petite Noir. That's life coming back. Around us, Paris kept moving. I could hear the muffled roll of bicycles over cobblestones, the distant shouts of children released from morning lessons, a busker's accordion spilling through the open window. All the ordinary sounds of a city that had no idea a life was being fought for in this small, sterile room. It felt strange, almost unfair, that the world outside continued unchanged, while inside everything was shifting. I cleaned him gently with a damp cloth, wiping away the layers of filth that had clung to his fur for who knows how long. Each stroke revealed a little more of the shine beneath, though much of it was still dull, patchy, clumped. His tiny body trembled with the effort of enduring my touch, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he allowed it, as though surrendering to the care he had been denied for too long. The vet told me not to expect much, not yet. Recovery would be slow, uncertain. But as I watched Noir take another shaky sip of water, I felt something stir in me that went beyond caution. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. Hope blooming quietly against the backdrop of exhaustion and fear. That night, when the clinic grew still again and the outside lights of Paris painted golden streaks across the Seine, I sat beside him with my hand resting gently over his paw. He didn't move much, didn't make a sound. But when my fingers tightened ever so slightly, his paw twitched in return, just enough to let me know he was there, tethered still to this world. And in that fragile connection, I felt it, the first steps of his return. By the third morning, I could hardly recognize the bundle I had first carried in from the street. Noir was still frail, his ribs sharp beneath his black coat, but there was more light in his eyes now, more will in the way he blinked at me when I whispered his name. The vet nodded gently and said it was time, that if Noir had enough strength to eat and sip water, he was strong enough for something else. A bath. The word felt almost too simple for what it meant. This wasn't just about water and soap. This was about stripping away the last layer of neglect that clung to him like a second skin. I carried him into the small washroom at the back of the clinic, his body trembling, but not in fear, more in uncertainty. The sink gleamed under the fluorescent light, filled halfway with warm water that steamed faintly in the cool air. When I lowered him toward it, he stiffened at first, paws pushing weakly against my arm. My heart ached, afraid he would panic, but the vet whispered to me to be patient, to let him feel the warmth. I dipped my hand into the water and let it run down his back before setting him gently into the basin. He froze, legs splayed awkwardly, ribs heaving. Then, slowly, he stilled. The warmth seeped into his bones, and for the first time since I'd found him, I saw his body relax. The water turned dark almost immediately. Trails of dirt and filth spiraled away from his fur, swirling into clouds before fading into nothing. I cupped handfuls of water, pouring them gently along his spine, and watched as patches of his coat began to shine faintly through the grime. His true black was deeper, richer than I'd imagined, glinting like polished stone beneath the clinic light. He closed his eyes as I rubbed softly along his ears, not fighting, not whining, just enduring, almost leaning into the touch. His paws twitched now and then, tiny protests of weakness, but his breathing steadied. It was as if he was shedding not only dirt, but the memory of every night he had shivered alone on the streets. When it was done, I wrapped him in a thick white towel, his body swallowed in the folds. He looked up at me then, blinking, and for the first time, his face no longer carried only suffering. He looked fragile still, but cleaner, younger, as though I was seeing the puppy he should have been all along. I pressed my cheek lightly against his damp head, the scent of soap and warm fur rising to replace the stench of neglect. Paris outside roared on, horns, voices, the endless pulse of the city. But here, in my arms, there was only stillness, only the quiet weight of a life beginning to feel new. And in that moment, as drops of water slid down my arm and his paw pressed faintly into my chest, I thought, this is what rescue looks like. Not grand, not loud, just water, warmth, and the chance to start again. The weeks that followed passed like a blur, and yet each day felt like a small miracle strung to the next. Noir began to change before my eyes, and with him, so did I. The ribs that once cut sharply against his skin slowly softened under the touch of new weight. His coat, once dull and matted with dirt, now gleamed with a black sheen that caught the Paris light in ripples when he moved. The hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by something alive, something bright. Curiosity, mischief, even play. We took our first real walk together along the Seine, his short legs still a little unsteady, but determined. The morning air carried the smell of fresh bread from the boulangeries, mixed with the river's cool breath. Noir paused every few steps to sniff at the world as if it had all been made for him. The stones, the flowers tucked in window boxes, even the shoes of strangers who passed and smiled down at him. A few bent to pet him, and instead of shrinking back in fear, he pressed his little body forward, soaking up the touch he had once been starved of. There was one moment I will never forget. We paused beneath the shadow of Notre Dame, its towers rising like guardians above us. Noir sat at my feet, tail thumping clumsily against the cobblestones. I crouched down, brushing a hand along his back, and he looked at me with those wide, dark eyes. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against my chest in a gesture so simple yet so full of trust that my breath caught. I thought back to the night I first found him, broken, filthy, almost gone, and the weight of that contrast nearly undid me. He had survived. More than that, he had chosen life, chosen me. And in doing so, he had given me something I hadn't realized I was missing. I'd gone through years of walking these streets as just another face among millions, my heart hardened against the countless small tragedies the city hides. But now, with Noir trotting beside me, each step tapping against stone and rhythm, Paris felt different. The city hadn't changed, but I had. That night, when he curled into the crook of my arm on my bed, his breathing soft and even, I lay awake listening. No rattling gasps, no trembling shudders, just the steady rise and fall of a pup at peace. I thought of the first words I had whispered to him on the street, words I hadn't been sure I could keep. You're safe now. And as I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of his small body pressed against me, I finally believed them. Noir was no longer just a stray left behind in the cracks of Paris. He was home. He was mine. And the city, vast and eternal, suddenly felt smaller, softer, because it now held the sound of his paws, the light of his eyes, and the quiet miracle of his second chance.